Hello, my lovely lunatics. We are on my beautiful hammock where I read books when I'm not reading to you guys. So I thought we should read our book here because it's outside and you can hear birds and it's lovely. So I'm going to get right into it. We're reading The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth, and we're on chapter 18, The Wise Demon of the Templars. The prophecies of Joachim, the loves of Roman Lull, St. Francis and the Buddha, Roger Bacon Mox, Thomas Aquinas, the Templars worship Baphomet. In 1076, Turkish Muslims took control of Jerusalem and began to persecute Christian pilgrims. The Crusaders freed Jerusalem, then lost it again. In 1119, 5 knights met under the leadership of Hugo de Payens at the place of the crucifixion. Like the knights who had ridden in the quest for the Grail, they vowed to make themselves worthy vessels to carry the blood of Christ. In order to protect pilgrims, they set up their headquarters in what was believed to have been the site of the stables attached to the Temple of Solomon. Founded between the First and Second Crusade, they became Christianity's crack troops. The Knights Templar are the order of the poor soldiers of Christ, and the Temple of Solomon, to give them their full title, always wore sheepskin breeches beneath their outer clothing, as a symbol of their chastity. And they were forbidden to cut their beards. They were to own nothing except a sword, holding all property in common. They were never to ask for mercy from the enemy, only retreating if the odds were 3-1. And though they might retreat, they would always in the end have to fight to the death. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the founder of the Cistercian monastic order and the most influential churchman of the day, wrote the order or rule book of the Templars in 1128, so that they became formally a religious order. Bernard said of the Templars that they knew no fear, that one of them has often put to flight 1,000, that they were gentler than lambs, grimmer than lions, and theirs was the mildness of monks and the valor of knights. The archaeological evidence seems to confirm that the Templars may have had an ulterior motive for the setting up of their headquarters, to excavate the site of the temple. Templar artifacts have been discovered in tunnels deep below it. These tunnels have been cut out of solid rock in a direction that would have taken them directly under the supposed site of the Holy of Holies. The initiation ceremony of the Templars clearly brought together different traditions, including Sufism and the Solomonic wisdom of the temple. A lamb was killed, and from its body a cord was made and placed around the candidate's neck. He was led into the initiation chambers by this cord. He had been made to swear that his intentions were completely pure, on pain of death, and now the candidate wondered if the Grand Master could see into his soul by occult means. Was he about to die? Candidates endured frightening ordeals of the type that candidates for initiation by Zarathustra had had to undergo, involving confrontations with dreadful demonic forces, so that they would be prepared to face death and any horrors they might encounter in their later lives or after death. These confrontations with demons and initiation would come back to haunt the Templars, but for about 200 years their esprit de corps and tight organizational structure made them extraordinarily successful in influencing, if not directing, world affairs. Because many nobles joined the order, giving over rights to their property, the Templars became extremely rich. They invented letters of credit so that money could be transferred without risk of being stolen by robbers. Their temple in Paris became the center of French finances. They were in some ways the forerunners of banks, instrumental in preparing for the rise of the merchant classes. The Templars were also patrons of the first trade guilds to be independent of church and nobility, called the Compagnons du Devoir. These guilds were responsible for the Templars' building projects, maintained ethical codes in business, and protected members, widows, and orphans. At the end of the 12th century, other challenges to the supremacy of the court were arising. In 1190-91, Richard the Lionheart, grandson of Guillaume of Poitiers, the first troubadour, was returning from the Third Crusade. He stopped off to visit a mountain hermit who was becoming famous for his gift of prophecy. The report came back with Richard, "What black tidings lie beneath that cowl?" Born in a small village in Calabria in about 1135, Joachim had lived as a hermit for many years, before joining an abbey and eventually founding his own abbey of Ferrer in the mountains. He was trying to understand the revelations of St. John, wrestling with it, as he put it, and being defeated. Then, one Easter morning, he awoke a new man, having been granted a new faculty of understanding, The prophetic commentaries that then poured out of him would influence spiritual thought and mystical groups throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, and then later the Rosicrucians. There's a Kabbalistic dimension of Joachim's writing, even though the central books of the Cabala had yet to be published, perhaps the result of his friendship with Petrus Alfonsi, a Spanish-Jewish convert. Of course, the Old Testament itself had a strong sense of God working through history, but what is specifically Kabbalistic about Joachim's thought is his interpretation of biblical texts in terms of complex number symbolism and his vision of what he called the Tree of Life. He published a diagram of this tree 200 years before a similar idea was published by Kabbalists. Most likely drawing on oral tradition he encountered through his friendship with Alfonsi. But the aspect of Joachim's teaching that really grabbed the medieval imagination was his theory of three. He argued that if the Old Testament was the age of the Father, which had called for fear and obedience, and if the New Testament was the age of the Son, the age of the Church and of the faith, then the reality of the Trinity suggests that a third age is coming, an age of the Holy Spirit. Then the Church will no longer be necessary, for this will be an age of freedom and love. Because Joachim was an initiate, there was also an astrological dimension to his thought, usually glossed over by church commentators. The age of Aries was the age of the Father, Pisces the age of the Son, and Aquarius the age of the Holy Spirit. Joachim prophesied that there would be a time of transition from the second to the third age, when a new order of spiritual men would educate humanity, when Elijah would reappear as prophesied in the late version of the Old Testament in the book of Malachi. Elijah would be the forerunner of the Messiah, arriving to usher in the great innovato. Joachim also prophesies that the Antichrist will incarnate before the third age begins. As we shall see, Joachim's prophecies still fascinate the secret societies today. Ramon Lull, Dr. Illuminatus, was a missionary to the Muslims whose thought was nevertheless saturated with Islamic ideas. Raymond Lull was born in Palma, the capital of Majorca, in 1235 and brought up as a page in the royal court. He led a carefree life of pleasure. One day, lusting after a Genoese lady and wanting her badly, he rode his horse into the church of Ilulia, where she was praying. She turned him away, but one day she responded to verses he had sent her by summoning him to a tryst. When he arrived, without warning, she exposed her breast to him. It was being eaten away by a malignant disease. This shock marked the beginning of the process of Lull's conversion. It helped form his view of the world as a place of oscillating extremes where appearances might well mask their opposites. In his most famous book, The Book of the Lover and the Beloved, he asks, "When comes the hour in which water that flows downwards shall change its nature and mount upwards?" He talks of the lover falling among thorns, but how they seem to him like flowers and a bed of love. What is misery, he asks, to get one's desire in this world? If you see a lover clothed in fine raiment, he says, sated with food and sleep, know that in that man thou seest damnation and torment. The scent of flowers brings to the lover's mind the evil stench of riches and meanness, of old age and lavishness, of discontent and pride. Lull wrote of mounting the ladder of humanity to glory in the divine nature. This mystical ascent is achieved by working on what he calls the powers of the soul, feeling, imagination, understanding, and will. In this way, he was helping to forge the deeply personal form of alchemy that, as we will see, would be the great engine of esoteric Europe. In one of his harsher sayings, he warned, "If thou speakest truth, O fool, thou wilt be beaten, by men tormented, reproved, and killed." While preaching to the Muslims in North Africa, he was set upon by a crowd, led out of the city, and stoned to death. Francis was born into a world where serfs suffered extreme poverty, and where the deformed, the aged, the destitute, and lepers were treated with utter contempt. The wealthy clergy made a good living out of the serfs and persecuted anyone who disagreed with them. In 1206, Francis was a rich young man in his 20s in Assisi in Italy. He was leading a carefree and heartless life, avoiding all contact with hardship, holding his nose if he saw a leper. It is impossible not to see the parallels with the life of Prince Siddhartha. Then one day he was out riding when his horse suddenly reared up and he found himself looking down at a leper. He dismounted and before he knew it was grasping the leper's bloody hand and kissing the suppurating cheeks and lips. He felt the leper withdraw his hand, and when Francis looked up he saw the leper had vanished. He knew then that, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, he had had an encounter with the risen Christ. Francis's life and philosophy were turned upside down and inside out. He began to see with all clarity that the Gospels recommended a life of poverty, devoted to helping others, possessing neither gold nor silver nor money in your purse, no wallet for your journey, nor two coats nor shoes. Poverty, he was to say, is to have nothing, to wish for nothing, yet to possess all things truly in the spirit of freedom. He came to see that experience itself, not things experienced, are important. The things we possess have a hold on us and threaten to rule our lives. A voice emanating from a painted crucifix in the church of San Domenico near Assisi told him, "Go, Francis, and repair my house, which as you can see is falling into ruin." For Francis, this experience was both ineffable and irresistible. He so transformed his nature in its animal, vegetable, and as we shall see shortly, in its material dimensions, that animals responded to him in an amazing way. A cricket sang when he asked, birds gathered to hear him preach. When a large, fierce wolf terrorized the mountain town of Gubbio, Francis went out to meet it. The wolf ran towards Francis, but when he ordered it to not hurt anyone, the wolf lay down at his feet. It then began to walk alongside him, completely tamed. A few years ago, a wolf's skeleton was found, buried underneath the floor of the church of San Francesco della Pace in Gubbio. If we compare the mysticism of Rim and Lowell with that of St. Francis, we see that a profound change has taken place in a very short time. Francis's mysticism is the mysticism of simple natural things, of the open air and the everyday. In the first biography of St. Francis, The Little Flowers of St. Francis, it is said of him that he discovered the hidden things of nature with his sensitive heart. To Francis, all things were alive. He was an ecstatic vision of the cosmos, as idealism conceives it, everything created and charged with life by the celestial hierarchies. All creation sings in unison in the canticle of brother sun and sister moon. All praise be yours, my Lord, through all you have made, and first my Lord, brother sun, who brings the day. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister moon and stars, in the heavens you have made them, bright and precious and fair. The spirit of Christianity had once helped the evolution of Buddhism. It had introduced a spirit of enthusiasm that helped the Buddha's teaching of universal compassion find fulfillment in the material world. Now, although the Buddha did not incarnate again, his spirit here helped reform Christianity by inspiring a simple devotion and compassion for all living things. Near the end of his life, Francis was meditating on Mount Laverna, praying outside his hermit's cell, when suddenly the whole sky blazed with light, and a six-winged seraph appeared to him. Francis realized that this great being had the very same face he had seen on the painted crucifix that set him out on his mission. He understood that Jesus Christ was sending him on a new mission. Shortly after the death of St. Francis, trouble broke out in the order he had founded, the Franciscans. The Pope asked the order to take on extra responsibilities involving owning property and handling money. Many of the brothers saw this as a violation of St. Francis's vision, and they formed breakaway groups called the Spiritual Franciscans, or Fraticelli. Both to themselves and to many outsiders, they seemed like the new order of spiritual men whom Joachim had prophesied would oversee the end of the church. So it was that followers of St. Francis came to be hunted down and killed as heretics. A famous fresco by Giotto shows St. Francis propping up the church. If Francis saved the church from complete collapse, can he be said to have succeeded in reforming it as the voice from the crucifix had asked? In esoteric Christianity, it is believed that the seraph who gave Francis the stigmata told him that his new mission was to be fulfilled after death. Once a year, on the anniversary of his death, 3 October, he was to lead the spirits of the dead out of the lunar spheres into the higher hierarchies. Initiation, as we continue to see, is as concerned with life after death as much as this life. In the lifetimes of Ramon and Francis, new impulses for reform and purification of religious practice were growing up in many parts of Europe, in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and above all, in south of France. There, the Cathars attacked the corruption of the Church. Their Gnostic-like central tenet was that they should keep themselves completely pure from an evil world. Like both the Templars and St. Francis, they renounced material possessions and kept strict vows of chastity. The Cathars had no churches of wood or stone. They rejected a sacramental system that made the Church the only intermediary between God and the people. "We value virginity above everything," said one witness. "We do not sleep with our wives, but love them as we would love our sisters. We never eat meat. We hold our possessions in common." They had only one prayer, the Lord's Prayer, and their initiation ritual, the Consolentium. was saying goodbye to an evil world. They welcomed martyrdom. The church obliged. In 1208, Pope Innocent III ordered a crusade against the Cathars. Arriving at the town of Béziers, the crusaders demanded that it hand over the 500 or so Cathars inside. When the townspeople refused, all of them, running into many thousands, were slaughtered. When one of the soldiers asked the papal legate Arnaud Amari how they might distinguish the Cathars from the others, he is said to have replied with a phrase that has echoed down history: "Kill them all, God will find his own." At Bran they stopped off to take 100 hostages. They cut off their noses and upper lips. They blinded all except one, who led a procession to the castle. At Lavar they captured 90 knights, hanged them, then stabbed them when they took too long to die. An entire army of prisoners was burned alive at Minerve. In 1244, the last few remaining heretics, who had survived a 9-month siege of the mountaintop castle of Montdegar, gave themselves up. 200 Cathar monks descended the mountain and walked into the fires awaiting them. According to the legend, 4 monks had escaped the mountaintop refuge a day earlier, taking with them the secret treasure of the Cathars. We do not know whether the treasure was gold, relics, or secret doctrine, but perhaps it is too easy to romanticize the Cathars. Like the Cathars, they taught that the world was evil in a way that suggests that they, like the Gnostics before them, were under the sway of a world-hating, death-loving, Oriental philosophy. The Church at Rome suppressed the Cathars with maximum force, but the true esoteric thought of the age was closer to it than the jugular vein. In the closing years of the 13th century, a weak and sickly child was born. Shortly after birth, he was taken in and looked after by 12 wise men. In Rudolf Steiner's account, they lived in a building that had belonged to the Templars at Montsalvat, on the border between France and Spain. Because the boy was kept completely shut away from the outside world, the locals were unable to see anything of his miraculous nature. He was filled with such a strong, shining spirit that his little body became transparent. The 12 men initiated him in about 1254, and he died shortly afterwards, having shared his spiritual vision with those who had looked after him. The 13 had helped prepare for his next incarnation when he would change the face of Europe. Albertus was born in 1193, apparently a dull and stupid boy until inspired by a vision of the Virgin Mary. Then he began to pursue his studies so zealously that he quickly became the most famous philosopher in Europe. He studied Aristotle's science, physics, medicine, architecture, astrology, and alchemy. The short text, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegius, containing the central Hermetic axiom, "as above, so below," first surfaced into esoteric history as part of his library. He almost certainly explored methods of divining the presence of metals deep in the earth using occult techniques. It is said he built a strange ottoman he called the android, able to speak, perhaps even think and move about of its own free will. It was made of brass and other metals, chosen because of their magical correspondence with heavenly bodies, and Albertus made it come alive by breathing magical incantations into it with prayers. The legend that Albertus Magnus was the architect of Cologne Cathedral probably derives from his authorship of Liber Constructionism Alberti, containing the secrets of operative Freemasons, including the layering of the foundations of cathedrals along astronomical lines. Stories of journeys underground, like those of Albertus Magnus to discover metals, are often ways of alluding to underground initiations. We know that initiations of this type survived into the Middle Ages because of an account of one that took place in Ireland, which has come down to us from 3 sources. A soldier called Owen, who served the English king Stephen, went to the monastery of St. Patrick in Donegal. Owen fasted for 9 days, processing around the monastery and taking baths of ritual purification. On the 9th day, he was admitted to the underground chamber, out of which all who enter do not return. There he was laid down in a grave. The only light was from a single aperture. That night Owen was visited by 15 men, robed all in white, who warned him that he was about to undergo a trial. Then all of a sudden, a troop of demons appeared. They held him over a fire before showing him scenes of torment like those described by Virgil. Finally, 2 elders came to guide him and showed Owen a vision of paradise. Albertus was spiritual guide to Thomas Aquinas, nearly 33 years his junior. It seems that Thomas smashed his master's android to pieces, in some accounts because he believed it diabolical, in others because it would never stop talking. Aquinas had come to the University of Paris to study Aristotle at the feet of the master, but he was to discover that the greatest Aristotelian was in fact a Muslim. Erebos argued that Aristotelian logic showed Christianity to be absurd. Would logic eat up religion, all true spirituality? Aquinas' life work culminated in his massive Summa Theologica, perhaps the most influential work of theology ever written. Its aim was to try to show that philosophy and Christianity are not only compatible, they illumine each other. Aquinas applied the sharpest analytical scalpel to thought about the spiritual worlds. He was able to categorize the beings of the heavenly hierarchies, the great cosmic forces that create natural forms as well as creating our subjective experiences. The Summa contains, for example, the Church's definitive teachings on the four elements, and this is achieved with a living, penetrating intellect rather than a stultifying reshuffling of dead dogma. Aquinas is a key figure in the secret history, then, because his great intellectual triumph over Averroes prevented Europe's being overcome by scientific materialism several hundred years too early. Again, it is important to bear in mind that this triumph was achieved from the standpoint of direct personal experience of the spirit worlds. There is not a shadow of a doubt that Thomas Aquinas, like Albertus Magnus, was an alchemist who believed it was possible to harness the power of disembodied spirits to effect changes in the material world. Of the many alchemical texts attributed to him, scholars accept at least one as undoubtedly genuine. In order to understand this better, it's useful to compare with his contemporary Roger Bacon. Today, alchemy can seem a strange hole-in-the-wall activity. In fact, it is quite familiar to all church-going Catholics because it is what takes place at the climax of the Mass. Aquinas first formulated the doctrine of the transubstantiation of the bread and wine. What he described is essentially an alchemical process in which the substance of the bread and wine changes and a parallel transubstantiation takes place in the human body. The Mass brings about not just a new frame of mind, a new determination to do better, but a vital physiological change. It is no accident that Aquinas formulated his doctrine at the same time that the stories of the Grail began to circulate. They describe the same process, albeit using different methods. Though they were enemies, Bacon mocked Aquinas for only being able to read Aristotle in translation. Both Aquinas and Bacon were representatives of the great impulse of the age, to strengthen and refine the faculty of intelligence. They found magic in thinking. The capacity for prolonged abstract thought, for juggling with concepts, had existed once before, but only briefly and locally in the Athens of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, before being snuffed out again. A new, living, and more long-lasting tradition arose with Aquinas and Bacon. Both put experience before the dead-old categories of tradition, and both were deeply religious men who sought to refine their religious beliefs on the basis of experience. Without experience, said Bacon, it is impossible to know anything. Bacon was the more practical, but when he explored the mind's supernatural capacities, he invoked entities from the same spiritual hierarchies that Aquinas categorized. Both applied rigorous analysis and logic, and their mysticism was quite unlike the unthinking, ecstatic mysticism of the Templars. A young scholar at Oxford in the 1250s, Roger Bacon resolved, like Pythagoras before him, to know everything there is to know. He wanted to gather together into his own mind all that the scholars at the court of Harun al-Rashid had known. Roger Bacon became the image of a wizard known as Dr. Mirabilis. He sometimes appeared on the streets of Oxford in Islamic robes. Otherwise, he worked without rest day and night in his rooms in college, which would be rocked by explosions from time to time. Bacon busied himself conducting practical experiments, for example, with metals and magnetism, discovering gunpowder independently of the Chinese, or scaring his students by shining a light onto a crystal in order to produce a rainbow, something which up until that time people had believed only God could do. He also had a magic looking glass that enabled him to see 50 miles in any direction because he, unlike anyone else alive at the time, understood the property of lenses. But it is undoubtedly true that Bacon had also had powers beyond the ability of science to explain today. He sent his complete works to Pope Clement IV in the mind of a 12-year-old boy called John, whom he had taught to know all his many books off by heart in just a few days. Bacon used a method that involved prayers and magic symbols. Similarly, he was able to teach students Hebrew so well that they could read all of the scripture in a matter of weeks. All magic is a power of mind over matter. As we are beginning to see, esoteric philosophy is concerned with methods for developing the faculties of the mind so that natural laws can be manipulated. In Roger Bacon, the faculties of intelligence and imagination were highly developed, and each worked one on the other. In 1270 he wrote, "It is possible to make engines of navigation which have no need of men to navigate them, so that very large sea-going ships may go along with one man to steer, and at greater speed than if they were full of men working them. And cars could be made that would move at inestimable speeds without animals to draw them. Flying machines can be built so that a man sitting in the middle of the machine may turn an instrument by which wings artificially made will beat there." In the Middle Ages, this remarkable man had a complete vision of the modern technological world created by experimental science. Bacon was a Francian who, like the founder of his order, longed for a better, cleaner, kinder world for the poor and the dispossessed. There is a telling point in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, when William of Baskerville echoes Sherlock Holmes like hero, explains that there are two forms of magic: a devil's magic that seeks to harm others by illicit means, and a holy magic which rediscovers the secrets of nature, a lost science known to the ancients. Like the Arab alchemist who influenced him, Bacon worked on the borderline of magic and science, and this borderline, we will see, is what alchemy essentially is. Bacon wrote a treatise called The Mirror of Alchemy, and liked to recall a saying of a great scholar of the Cabala, St. Jerome: "You will find many things quite incredible, and beyond the bounds of probability, that are true for all that." In 1273, Thomas Aquinas, nearly the completion of his massive Summa Theologica, was taking Mass at a church in Naples when he had an overwhelming mystical experience. He wrote, "What has been revealed to me now makes all I've written worth no more to me than a stack of straw." We've had hints of the training of the imagination in Lowe and Bacon. Of course, idealists have a more exalted view of imagination than materialists. For idealists, imagination is a faculty for grasping a higher reality. The discipline of training the imagination is central to esoteric practice. The initiations of the secret societies, and indeed of magic, for esotericists and occultists, imagination is also important because imagination is the great creative force in the universe. The universe is the creation of God's imagination. Imagination, as we saw in Chapter 1, was the first emanation, and it is our imaginations that allow us to interpret the creation and to manipulate it. Human creativity, whether magical or non-magical, is the result of a particular channeling of the powers of the imagination. In alchemical tracts, for example, sperm is described as created by the imagination. This is a way of saying that imagination not only informs desire, it also has the power to transform our very material natures. Powerful magical transformations in the material world outside their bodies can be made by initiates who know how to work on these creative powers of the imagination. An Indian adept is taught from an early age to practice seeing a snake in front of him with such concentrated power, with such a highly trained imagination, that he can eventually make others see it too. Of course, there's a danger in all this emphasis on the imagination, that it takes us perilously close to fantasy. There's always a risk that these workings on the imagination will only end up in delusion. Magic can seem a self-deluder's charter. The systematic approach of the secret societies was intended to militate against this. St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote the Rule of the Templars, recommended a systematic training of the imagination by summoning up images of the birth, infancy, ministry, and death of Jesus Christ. You can invoke his spirit if you imagined, say, a domestic scene involving Jesus Christ, imagining the pots and pans, the clothes, his likeness, the lines on his face, the expression in his features, your own feelings when he turned to look at you with that expression. Then, if you all of a sudden banish the visual images, what might be left is the very real spirit of Christ. In 13th century Spain, a Kabbalist called Abraham Abulfia wrote amplifying the idea of God's creative word. In earlier Kabbalistic texts, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet had been described as creative powers. In the beginning, then, God had combined these letters in patterns and made words out of them, and out of this process unfolded all the different shapes of the universe. Abraham Abulfia proposed that the initiate could participate in the creative process by combining and recombining Hebrew letters in the same way. He recommended retiring to a quiet room, dressing in white robes, adopting ritual poses, pronouncing the divine names of God. In this way, a state of ecstatic visionary trance could be achieved, and with this state, secret powers. The notion of words of power, which give the initiate domination over the spirit worlds and so over the material world, is a very ancient one. Solomon was said to have had this domination, and in his temple, the Tetragrammaton, the most sacred and powerful name of God, might only be pronounced once a year on the Day of the Atonement by the high priest alone in the Holy of Holies. Outside trumpets and cymbals prevented others from hearing. It was said that someone who knew how to pronounce it could inspire terror in angels. Even earlier, among the Egyptians, it was said that the sun god, Ra, had created the cosmos using words of power. It was said that knowledge of these words gave the initiate power not only in this life, but in the afterlife. Abraham Abufia also recommended using the names of God in diagrammatic form. The practice of working with magical signs and sigils again features largely in Hebrew tradition, and with an admixture of Egyptian and Arab elements, it became widespread in the Middle Ages. This was largely because of the spread of grimoires, grammars of spells, such as the Testament of Solomon and the Key of Solomon. Most of the spells promised the fulfillment of selfish desires, whether sexual, avenging, or the finding of treasure. Preparation of materials such as beeswax, the blood of an animal, powdered lodestone, sulfur, and perhaps the brain of a raven might be followed by an act of purification. Then came the ceremony itself, perhaps involving sickles, wands, swords, performed at propitious times to invoke a disembodied being. The result might be that a ring or perhaps scrap of paper was inscribed with sigil or signature, so that the carrier of it, wittingly or unwittingly, would be dully affected by the disembodied being for good or for ill. In the mid-14th century, the sacred magic of Abraham the Jew taught how to excite tempests, raise the dead, walk on water, and be beloved of a woman. All of this was to be achieved by using sigils and squares of Kabbalistic letters. Today, the Church makes a clear distinction between a few strictly regulated ceremonies intended to invoke spiritual powers taking place within a church context, and all other ceremonies intended to invoke or otherwise engage in commerce with disembodied spirits not under its aegis. These latter are labeled occult, which in modern Christian parlance usually means black magic. In the Middle Ages, no such distinction would have been practical. Rituals were performed under the aegis of the church to try to ensure, for example, good crops or success in a duel. Consecrated bread was seen as a cure for the sick and a preservative against the plague. Amulets giving protection against lightning and drowning were made out of church candles. Scraps of paper bearing magical formula were inserted into roofs as protection against fire. Church bells could ward off thunder and demons. Formal curses were pronounced to drive away caterpillars. Holy water was scattered on the fields to ensure a good harvest. Holy relics were wonder-working fetishes. Baptism could restore sight to blind children, and overnight vigils at the shrines of saints would bring vivid visionary dreams and cures in the tradition of the temple sleep. Advocated by Asclepius, later Christian apologists tried to distinguish between legitimate church practice, a matter of petitioning high-level spiritual beings who might choose to agree to request or not, and magic conceived as a mechanical process involving the manipulating of occult forces. But this involves a misunderstanding. Magic is also an uncertain process of invoking spirits, including some spirits of very high levels. In the Middle Ages, everyone believed in these spiritual hierarchies. Underlying all church practice and lay spiritual practice was a belief that repeating a formula, such as a prayer, or performing a ceremony, had the power to influence material events for good or ill. By means of these activities, people believed that they could communicate with the orders of disembodied beings who controlled the material world. That prayer was efficacious, that providence rewarded the good and punished the bad, was then the universal belief and the universal experience. If history was seen unquestioningly of a prudential process, it was not in a fatalistic way. God had a plan for humankind that different orders of disembodied beings and different orders of incarnated beings were helping to unfold a plan encoded in the Bible and elucidated by prophets, but it was a plan that might go wrong at any time. Friday the 13th is still remembered as an evil day. On Friday 13, October 1307, Friday the 13th was the day that I fractured my femur and totaled my first truck that I loved. The kings of the world finally moved to try to eradicate the esoteric influencers they feared had been growing further and further from their control. Just before dawn, the Senecals of France, acting on the orders of the French king, Philip the Fair, descended on the temples and lodgings of the Templars, arresting some 15,000 people. In the Paris Temple, France's great center of finance, they found a secret chamber containing a skull, two thigh bones, femur bone, and a white burial shroud, which is, of course, what you will find if you break into a Freemasonic temple today. Only a few of the knights managed to escape from La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast. They fled to Scotland, where they lived under the protection of the rebel leader, Robert the Bruce. The Inquisition accused the captured knights of making novices spite the trample on the cross of Christ. They were accused, too, of sodomy and worshipping a goat-headed idol called Baphomet. They confessed seeing this idol with a long beard, sparkling eyes, and 4 feet. Under pressure from Philip the Fair, Pope Clement published a bill of abolition, putting an end to the Knights Templar. All their assets were seized by the monarchy. Appearing before a papal commission, the knights said they had been tortured to make them confess. One Bernard de Vardo produced a wooden box in which he kept the charred bones that had fallen from his feet as they were roasted over a fire. What was the truth behind their confessions? Shortly before he died, I was privileged to work with Hugh Schonfield, the great scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Schonfield did much to explain the Christian scholars' Jewish roots of the New Testament that had hitherto been overlooked or misunderstood. Schonfield knew of the Atbash Sifar, in which the first letter of an alphabet is substituted for the last, second for the second last, and so on. He also knew that this cipher had been used to encrypt messages in the book of Jeremiah and in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Instinct led him to try out on the word Baphomet. In this way, he found coded in Baphomet the word wisdom. The personification of wisdom that Templars confessed communing with was, however, the goat-headed god of worldly wisdom. Since the time of Zarathustra, initiation ceremonies had induced in the candidate altered states in which he underwent terrifying ordeals, was attacked by demons, and so prepared to overcome the worst that life and life after death had to offer. Now the cunning tortures of the Inquisition were able to cause their victims such pain that they re-entered an altered state of consciousness, and it was then that the demon king Baphomet appeared to them again, this time in triumph. They were indeed facing the worst that life and death had to offer. That's interesting because of all the stuff you see today about, like, Freemasons or Illuminati or whatever, like, worshipping Baphomet, might have some truth to it. So that's the end of chapter 18. Next time we read The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth, we will be on chapter 19, Fools for Love. Thank you so much, my lovely lunatics. I hope you enjoyed our adult bedtime stories. If you didn't already, please subscribe. It helps so much. Smash the like button so more people will see the video. Comment your thoughts on this chapter, and maybe even share the video. Ring the notification bell so you get notified when we upload new chapters. Thank you so much, my lovely lunatics. Until next time, goodbye.